Hello, everyone. I'm Nicu Popescu. I'm head of the wider Europe program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Wider Europe in ECFR jargon means Turkey, the Western Balkans, the Eastern Partnership, and Russia. And here we are today to discuss the summit between Presidents Biden and Putin with three prominent, well-known speakers that need no introduction. And we've tried to squeeze a European view in this summit of the two great global powers. And we want to make sure that within the summit, there's also a European contribution, even if that contribution happens not just through this channel, but nonetheless, given our audience and our work, we thought it would be important to have this conversation within a format that is not just bilateral. So with this, I would start by inviting Angela Stent to be the first speaker and to share with us her thoughts, both on the summit, on the kind of middle and longer term prospects on US-Russia relations. And as I said, Angela needs no introduction, but as a reminder, she's director of the Russia, Eurasia, and Eastern European Center at Georgetown University, and she's the author of a recent book called Putin's World, Russia Against the West and with the Rest. It would have been easier to show it on a real life panel, but I'll show it here. It's always good to encourage people to read, especially that in the last year, we've all traveled less, so I used some of that safe time to do more reading than I did before, and Angela's book is one of these ways I try to remain connected to these big issues that we're here to discuss today. Angela, the floor is yours. You have 10-12 minutes, and then we'll see how things go and how many questions are. Please.
Great. Thank you very much, Nicu, and thank you for inviting me to speak to the European Council on Foreign Relations. I'm very glad to do it. So I'm going to set the stage for the summit and explain a little bit the background. For the past 4 years, the Kremlin cast a very long shadow over the White House. Russia became a domestic political issue in a way that it had never been before in the United States because of what happened during the 2016 election campaign and because of President Trump's unprecedented praise for Putin and because of questions about his own ties to Russia. Those who did not like Trump equated him with Russia. The Biden administration's goal is to remove Russia as a toxic domestic problem and to focus on managing Russia as a foreign policy issue. So this is an important development. Biden made it clear at the beginning of his presidency that he was not Trump. He used, of course, critical language about President Putin, which was, of course, reciprocated. But nobody now, or very few people in the US, are going to question Biden's own ties to Russia. And so he feels he's able to engage with President Putin with that, and that he's turned a page on his predecessor's policies. Biden's main priorities for these 4 years are domestic, getting over the pandemic, focusing on the economy and infrastructure, and dealing with the rather fragile state of US democracy. His top foreign policy priority is dealing with China, a rising assertive China as it's seen in the US, and Russia is viewed as a secondary challenge. The administration is also committed to restoring alliances, as we see this week with President Biden in Cornwall and then in Brussels. And there is a commitment to forge a common transatlantic policy on Russia, especially with Germany, Russia's most important European partner. Hence the decision to waive the sanctions on Nord Stream AG and its CEO, Matthias Warnig, and instead work with Germany behind the scenes to ensure that Ukraine will receive a revenue stream once Nord Stream 2 is up and running, which we gather will be soon. So against this background, Biden is meeting with Putin, not for the first time. They're both professional politicians. They have decades of experience, and there's no naivete on either side. Indeed, Biden is the 5th president that President Putin has to deal with. The goal of the summit from the US point of view is to establish guardrails in the relationship. In other words, to come to enough of an agreement with Russia on key principles that the US will be able to focus on the more challenging priority of dealing with China, without having constantly to deal with issues that emanate from Russia. Hence the mantra that you've heard from President Biden, Secretary Blinken, about creating a stable and predictable relationship with Russia. Now, I'm not sure that that's the Russian goal, but we will hear from Fyodor about that in a few minutes. Expectations for the summit on the US side are very modest. At a minimum, the summit will hopefully restore some semblance of normal diplomatic process. Right now, neither country has an ambassador in the other country, and because of waves of diplomatic expulsions and the new Russian designation of the United States as a hostile country and Russia's intention to ban all Russian citizens from working in the US embassy, the ambassador's residence in Moscow at Spaso House is closed. Hardly any visas can be given to Russian nationals. The embassy is operating on a skeleton staff. And in order to promote better ties, one surely needs to restore, again, a semblance of diplomatic normality. Beyond that, I think that both the Russian and American sides would like to come to some agreement on reestablishing the dialogue on strategic stability talks. New START expires in 2026, and it's time to begin thinking about what might come after it, since it, of course, is the only remaining arms control agreement that exists between the two countries. Preliminary discussions about setting up these strategic stabilities are already occurring, and the Biden administration needs to have more of its nominees in office in order for these strategic stability talks to proceed, but hopefully that will happen in the next few weeks. Strategic stability, of course, is a protean concept, and the question is, what will the content be of these discussions? Non-strategic nuclear weapons, missile defense, as the Russians would like, regional conflicts, cyber. The list is quite long, and I think it'll be quite a challenge to decide what to include in these talks. Now, once we leave the arms control dimension, I think it's unclear what else the two presidents are going to be able to agree to next week in Geneva. In principle, climate change is something that we can both work on. We know that President Putin has rather belatedly discovered climate change, but that Russia understands the full challenge there. The Arctic, again, which is not unconnected to issues of environment and climate change, is another area with Russia now having the chair of the Arctic Council that they could discuss. Iran will surely be part of the agenda there, as Russia has been working with the US as it seeks to rejoin the JCPOA. Afghanistan, I think, is another issue that's bound to come up. Russia is clearly concerned about what's going to happen once all of the US and NATO troops have withdrawn, and the Taliban, of course, becoming more and more prominent and seeking to come back to power, and what that would mean for Russia's own neighborhood. Global public health, of course, is something that could be a topic of discussion. We know that both sides are now engaging in vaccine diplomacy, but it is an area of pandemics where the two sides could work together. So those are issues where there could be some agreement on working together. I think the rest of the topics are going to be the cause of disagreement and contention. President Biden has been quite explicit that the purpose of his trip this week is to, first of all, with his allies, talk about the need to strengthen and promote democracy. And in an article that was published in the Washington Post last week, President Biden said, "We're standing united to address Russia's challenges to European security, starting with its aggression in Ukraine, and there will be no doubt about the resolve of the United States to defend our democratic values, which we cannot separate from our interests." So Ukraine will clearly come up in the talks. There's disagreement in the United States about why Russia amassed those 100,000 troops at the Ukrainian border some weeks ago, and of course eventually withdrew some, although about 80,000 still remain. I think it's believed that this was partly to test the Biden administration's resolve. We know that President Zelensky has finally received his invitation to visit the White House, but of course, Ukraine remains extremely vulnerable. And Biden, unlike his predecessor, is committed to supporting Ukraine. There'll surely be no agreement with President Putin on this issue. The same goes for Belarus, where our ambassador, by the way, has just been kicked out. There is the question of 3 Americans who are imprisoned in Russia that will clearly come up in these discussions. And it's interesting to note that that Russia declared, of course, Alexei Navalny's organization, an extremist organization, just, of course, days before the summit. And the issue of the Russian opposition will surely come up in these discussions too. Now, President Putin, I'm sure, will have a response to this. He's already accused the United States of violating the human rights of the January the 6th insurrectionists at the Capitol. The message clearly from Russia is going to be that the US has no right to interfere with what's going on domestically inside Russia. So Russia's cyber intrusions and its harboring of cyber criminals who've wreaked havoc on the American economy will also come up. In the last year, we've had the government-connected hacks of the SolarWinds platform, which stole a lot of data from government and private clients. More recently, we have these criminals who wreaked havoc on our gasoline supply in the United States, closing down the entire pipeline system in the East Coast. They hacked into a major meat processing plant, again, disrupting supplies of meat here. And there have been other examples. These are people, of course, who've demanded very large sums in ransom, and they appear to be criminals who are operating out of Russia. You know, Russia itself has said on several occasions it would like to sit down with the United States to discuss cyber rules of the road. So far, that hasn't happened, but surely this will come up as one of the issues in the discussions. Now, China is not at the summit, yet its shadow will loom over the meeting room in Geneva. The Biden administration is very concerned about the increasingly robust Russia-China partnership. It would like to pursue policies that would induce Russia to distance itself from China. This was one of the motivations why President Biden invited Putin to come to meet for a summit. I would think that President Putin will welcome the opportunity also to show China that Russia is sitting down with the United States, that the summit is happening, and that Russia itself has other options. But I think it's very unclear or very doubtful that Russia at this point would be interested in distancing itself from China. So the best case for the scenario will be for an agreement to restore full diplomatic ties, an agreement to prepare for strategic stability talks. The worst case, and you can't rule that out, will be if there's such profound disagreements in setting profound disagreements that the summit will end in division and in rancor. And I think it'll be very instructive to see if there's a joint press conference after the summit. So the last time that an American and a Russian leader met in Geneva was the Reagan-Gorbachev summit, the first one in 1985. That took months to plan. It lasted for 2 days. It produced a joint statement, and it was really instrumental in setting the stage for a much closer US-Russian relationship, as both Reagan and Gorbachev worked hard to establish close ties. It's a very different world in 2021, but it's still true, I think, that the key to advancing the US-Russian relationship will depend on whether the two presidents can indeed establish a minimal rapport and emerge from their talks with a mutual agreement on what the guardrails should be going forward. So I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Angela. Fyodor, it is your turn now to explain how these things are seen in Moscow and what are the hopes and expectations in Moscow. Please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nicu. Thank you for this invitation. And now, of course, these days, everybody is trying to discuss the forthcoming meeting. I'm afraid I will not be that different from what Angela said. My initial assumption is that we should put this meeting in a very concrete and relevant context of international situation and bilateral relationship, and to understand that this meeting is not about to agree on anything. It's not about to achieve some ways how to solve certain problems together and so on. This meeting, and I think the expectation in Moscow is very modest about the possible outcome. This meeting is basically about how to frame confrontation for next period. So we are de facto in the state of the Cold War. Of course, using this term, I understand that it's completely wrong, because the Cold War of second half of 20th century was very much different from the current situation, and the whole structure of the relationship and actors and circumstances are hardly comparable to what we had when Gorbachev and Reagan met in Geneva. But when it comes to the spirit, when it comes to the atmosphere, I'm afraid we have a reason to call it a new version of the Cold War in terms of mutual trust, or rather distrust. But the Cold War can be, or even this atmosphere can be managed in different ways. And the way how it was managed, or rather mismanaged in previous couple of years, was really terrifying. And relationship between Russia and the United States, which witnessed different periods before, but it turned into something completely irrational and completely beyond any normal analysis. So as I would read the intention of this meeting, at least on the Russian side, is to frame this new situation, to accept that we have not so big chance to achieve any agreement, substantial agreement to address particular issues together and to achieve some solutions. But it's important, maybe even urgently needed, to have this framework of more or less rational, understandable rivalry between Russia and the United States. During the Cold War, during the real Cold War, after a series of crises in 50s and 60s, we achieved something like a setup of rules, red lines, which should be taken into account by both sides. And that was, for that situation, that was at least some kind of assurance that confrontation would not go to beyond a certain level of risk. So we lost this framework after the Cold War, because no one believed it was needed anymore. But now, unfortunately, we are back to this very much confrontational and hostile environment. So the need to be cautious in ways how we confront each other, it's accepted on both sides again. And I think that that will be basically the main goal of Putin and Biden in Geneva, to frame this new framework. Relationship between Russia and the United States after 2014, and especially after 2016, was not just bad. It was absolutely abnormal, irrational, and partially, or maybe to large extent, because of what Angela mentioned, this symbiosis or merger of domestic and foreign, domestic and international. So Russia became subject in US domestic politics. United States has always been a subject of Russian domestic politics. And the specificity of Trump administration contributed very much to make this relationship absolutely destructive. So despite a certain kind of interest which Putin and Biden had vis-a-vis each other, I wouldn't say sympathy, but they really looked at each other with big curiosity, so to say. But that was personal. As for a relationship between Russia and the United States, it was totally ruined during the Trump administration. And at the beginning, as all of you know, on the Russian side, we had some expectations about Trump and illusions about Trump. But at the end of Trump's period, I think most of people here, even here, were very much tired of his administration. So in this regard, Biden was not very much welcome, but it was not seen as disaster. So it was fine when Biden won. So as for practical result of this meeting, I think we are back to old good stuff. If we look at the relationship between Moscow and Washington from the beginning, from 1950s, so the strategic stability issue has always been the core of this relationship, which is highly understandable, because as long as Russia and the United States have possibility to physically eliminate each other, that will remain the key factor of relationship. So is it good or bad? That's another discussion, but it's fact of life. During Trump administration, by the way, this core, which has served as a stabilizing factor under all previous administrations, including Obama and Clinton and Bush Jr., but under Trump, it was almost destroyed as well, because Trump himself was totally disinterested in this issue, and his a team like Mr. Bolton or Mr. Billingsley, they were very much interested, but they wanted to just to eliminate this issue, just to remove it from the agenda. So now we, since Biden and his team, they are back to classical approach. They believe it's very important. They started with the prolongation of New START agreement, and I think now it's a chance to be back to more or less normal discussion, which I agree totally with Angela. This discussion will be extremely complicated, because we need basically to invent a new model of how to address strategic stability in the 21st century. Old model has been exhausted. It was great, but has been exhausted due to absolutely new circumstances emerging, be it cyber sphere, be it new armament, be it new actors on this field like China and others. And all this should be taken into account. So I would personally, I would see the success, hypothetical success of this summit as a statement, maybe joint statement, maybe two separated statements, that the presidents decided to launch, they entrusted respective people, diplomats, military people, experts, to launch a very comprehensive discussion about ways how to establish and strengthen strategic stability in decades to come. Of course, this discussion will be not easy and will be long, but that's the only way to deal with this, just to launch it, just to start. As for the rest, and if they do, I would personally believe that it will be very successful meeting. As for the rest, certainly it is important to have exchange. I guess that this exchange will be quite frank. Biden said several times already that he will be very blunt with Putin. Putin used to be blunt anyway. So this is, in this particular situation, I think it's good, it's okay. But I cannot imagine any other issues which can bring some kind of mutual understanding which can be implemented into next steps. So the question on the topic, which is very popular right now, and which is presented as hypothetical common ground for Russia and the United States, is climate. And I think indeed that this issue should be discussed and will be discussed, especially given the fact that John Kerry, who is in charge of this in the United States, is pretty respected in Russia and has very good relationship with several people here. But objectively, I don't believe that climate issue now might become a unifying, because if we look at, if we put aside a lot of nice rhetoric, but in fact, climate is a new field of competition, not just between Russia and the US or Russia and EU. US-European relationship should be harmonized. China has its own policy on climate. So climate issue is not a global policy. This is set up of particular policies of different actors, where each actor will try to contribute by increasing its own capacities and advantages. So it's, I think, again, it's indeed it's a very important area, but not to expect harmony here either. As for regional issues, it should be exchanged, but no expectation of any unified position, be it Ukraine or Syria or whatever. And this toxic discussion about Russian domestic situation, domestic politics, I'm afraid that this is even less starter now than it used to be, because current approach of Russia, which is becoming more and more clear, we don't engage in any discussions of that at all, because it's not your business. Domestic affairs is not your business. You Americans don't like when somebody intervenes in your affairs. Fair enough, but please let's put it aside. Let's put it at a different. So it's not an issue for international discussion, especially between Russia and the United States. So certainly Biden will say all needed words about Navalny and other issues, but it's not. I don't expect even a discussion, even an exchange. I think Putin's position will be okay. Thank you very much, but let's go to the next point of our agenda. So certainly. Issues like Belarus and Ukraine will be touched upon, but again, I don't believe that we can expect any moves there. I think for Russia, it's important to understand how far Americans, for example, are ready to go in sanctioning Belarus and punishing Lukashenko for what happened recently. Of course, there's another question whether Russia is very much upset about that or not, because at the end of the day, it's not directly a Russian problem, it's a problem of Belarus. And if Belarus has absolutely no way to go but to Russia, okay, let's look what will happen. So I think to conclude, again, we are back to the more or less classical confrontation. As we know from previous period, the entourage of this confrontation will be completely different, but the core of hypothetical dialogue is as before, strategic stability, including all new forms of this notion.
Thank you very much, Fyodor. Kadri, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, I'm supposed to tell you what Europe expects from this summit. I don't think Europe expects very much. Europe definitely doesn't expect any surprises, which is already refreshing, sort of surprising even, if we think back to what the mood was in Europe on the eve of the Helsinki summit between Trump and Putin. Then you can see how things have changed. Unlike Trump and Putin, Biden and Putin, I don't think there is any curiosity or any positive personal expectations between them. By the way, they have worked together previously. Someone in Russia reminded me that under the presidents Obama and Medvedev, there was an intergovernmental commission headed by number twos, Vice President Biden and Prime Minister Putin. So if some of us have never heard of it, I had not, then it's probably not our fault, because that thing never properly took off, simply because these two didn't like each other and didn't click, and that institution never became very important. However, and maybe paradoxically, I think that now this lack of personal chemistry is somehow absolutely adequate and fitting basis for the relationship as we have and are going to have for the next 4 years. So that's not a shortcoming at all. My own view is, my historical memory doesn't go back as long as Reagan-Gorbachev meeting. I think the first summit that I followed personally was when Bill Clinton came to Moscow in 1995. Back then I was there as a journalist at press conferences. And my impression actually is that Joe Biden might be the first post-Cold War US president who has a totally realistic view of what Russia is and what the US can or cannot do about it. How much influence the US might have over Russia's domestic developments, or what Russia has been, what Russia might try to do in foreign policy. And I think that sober view is also very good. And I think that is actually good for Europe, because I don't think that Europe really has benefited from exaggerated expectations that we have seen at previous phases of relationship. If we think back to Bush and Putin, or Obama's reset, that might not have been even misconceived policy, but it clearly was miscommunicated policy. Russians expected something quite different from how it was designed in Washington. And I don't think that has really been good for Europe, not because there have been any attempts to conclude any deals above anyone's heads. That's not the case. Some people always have feared that, but I don't think that was actually ever in the cards. But simply because such ambitious relationships, they always, sometimes cut corners here or there, sometimes go sloppily about the facts on the ground, and they fuel expectations, and which then frustrated create backlash. And Europe is always bound to feel the effects of it. But likewise, also, I don't think it's good for Europe if Russia, if the sort of nature of Russia as a threat is exaggerated in Washington, or if it becomes the topic of domestic political struggle in Washington, as we have seen over the last 4 years, because that primitivizes the discussion about Russia in Washington and impoverishes the whole transatlantic discussion about Russia or what you can do. So I think actually as a European, unless I think we have reasons to be happy about what we are going to see. It is true that Europe is sidelined on most of those files that will become the agenda at the summit. Strategic stabilities, where the US holds the cards much more than Europe. But I think also that is fine. That's just nature of the things. And given how Russia, Europe, and the US disagree about how we view the world and what we want, I think it is natural that Europe can play lesser role at the moment in the relationship, because Europe is such a normative thing. rules and norms are in its DNA. It's much easier for the US to conclude deals, and arms control and things are where you can conclude. This is some business that you can handle by means of deals rather than rules and norms. So someone in Moscow regretted that Europe is sidelined. I think Europe takes it quite calmly. That's just the nature of the moment and the agenda. That doesn't mean that we have disappeared anyway. Now, and what to expect from the coming years? Well, Russia's foreign policy outlook seems to be influenced by, on the one hand, domestic situation, and on the other hand, its understanding of the world. And domestic situation is tense. The legitimacy of a Putinist regime is eroding. It's not because of Navalny, rather Navalny is a symptom of it, or the fact that Navalny has been viewed as a threat by some people is a symptom of the overall weakening of the political system. And I think that will continue until the political system in Russia finds a way to renew. It could be evolutionary, it could be alternatively, it could be revolutionary, but I think some renewal needs to happen at one point. And probably the people in the Kremlin know it, and that also makes them nervous. But as to the world, for Russia, as I see it, the world order is in flux. And there was 6 months ago, there was even much discussion in Russia about self-isolationism, how in these circumstances you shouldn't invest in any relationships because nothing can be achieved. I think that has retreated a little bit, but there are still doubts about where the world is going and what is the place of the United States in it. And there is some fear that the United States might want to re-establish its hegemony at the expense of Russia, putting pressure on Russia because that's easier than putting pressure on China, and to maybe create an illusion of being a tough, powerful country to compensate for not actually being it. And I think in these conditions, from the United States point of view, or from Europe's, less could be more. I don't think it is wise at the moment to try to confront Russia too forcefully when it comes to domestic issues, because that would only fuel domestic crackdown in Russia. It would fuel nervousness, and it would make people in Russia rally to the flag. If I have seen any sort of opening up of discussion in Russia, that actually happened when Trump was elected and Russia didn't feel threatened from the outside. This is not to say that the West should somehow create an impression that all is fine and good. What's happening in Russian domestic politics, that's clearly not the case. But I think we should be realistic about what we can or cannot do about it. And likewise, putting pressure in foreign policy context on Russia, I think one needs to be selective about it. And I think it impresses Moscow much more if we say less and mean it more, if we promise what we can deliver rather than more. And I think Biden administration has a good chance to follow that advice. They really seem to have excellent sober view about Russia. I'm not sure where it comes from. Biden personally, I'm sure there are advisors and they seem to be smart. I like how they have reprofessionalized US diplomacy. The level of signaling that the United States sends to Moscow, it has gone dramatically up compared to the Trump era and the Twitter diplomacy. I honestly applaud that. And I think diplomacy is the way forward. But by diplomacy, I mean not big breakthroughs in terms of deals or something like that, but rather the sort of diplomacy there was at some point in the Soviet time, where you really invest energy and skills into reading what the other side is doing and thinking, because policymaking process in Russia especially is quite complicated and not always so easy to understand. And you signal some red lines and read the other side's red lines and manage the confrontation that way. And I think if that is our expectation, then that is actually quite realistic that it'll be satisfied, that we will get it.
Thank you very much, Kadri. So I'll throw in a couple of questions and I'll encourage the listeners and the other participants at this event to ask questions in writing. I will do a round now and I will take the questions that you'll ask in the next few minutes in the second round. So I'll throw in a couple of things. So Fyodor, you were trying to suggest that basically a good summit would mean a switch from a kind of nasty Cold War into a nicer Cold War, which is a bit more rational. And that would be a good outcome for a good summit. And if the summit is bad, then we'll say it in this more irrational and nastier Cold War interaction that the West and Russia have. So partly building on that, there's a question on whether we're not witnessing a kind of de facto reset offer coming from the Biden administration. I've heard this feeling and sentiment being shared, not just for this question, but this is a lingering question on whether actually Biden, by making a couple of tough personal statements, has actually created space for himself to significantly diminish the temperature to the point of pursuing a de facto reset, at least on some issues which have been evoked here. So the question is from Yana Pulerian, aren't we now potentially witnessing a de facto hidden, unspoken reset? Another question I would have is, well, maybe a remark on this Green Deal. Every time I hear Europeans on engagement with, on interacting with Russia over climate change, that's mostly meant to be part of a potential selective engagement offer from the Europeans and the Russians. And most of the references to the Green Deal I hear in Russian debates are about an expectation of a new confrontation over the carbon adjustment mechanism. So the way actually the climate change issues and the changes that happen in the EU are potentially might be not a new selective engagement platform, but more of another subject that we add to the long list of confrontational issues. One question I would have is on Ukraine to all the speakers. I understand that there are no quick possibilities to move on Ukraine at this summit or maybe in the next months. Where do you see lay Russian and American interests in Ukraine in the next 5 to 10 years? What do you, Fyodor, see and expect Moscow to want in Ukraine over the next 5 to 10 years? And Angela, the same question goes to you vis-a-vis American interests. Is it kind of trying to deconflict the interaction with Russia around Ukraine through this or that way? You know, membership action plan, NATO-related issues with steps back or forward, or, you know, on the contrary, deepening the security partnership with Ukraine as a way of constraining Russian options. What do you think the US objectives in that part of the world lie in the next 5 to 10 years? And Kadri, maybe what is striking to me, of course, is that speaking of resets and successful summits, is that very often the European way of trying to have a good dialogue with Russia is to try to be nice. You throw a nice something, you throw in a lot of respect, a grand chateau, some nice statements about engagement, you avoid dealing with the tougher questions, and the Europeans have tried this several times and it didn't work. Whereas if we look at what Erdogan has been doing with Russia and what President Biden has been doing with Russia, they went the completely opposite route. They have exchanged tough punches, sometimes discursive, sometimes even military, around some Middle Eastern theaters of operations. And yet the dialogue between someone like the president of Turkey or the US president with Russia seems more stable. It has its own nasty turns, but there's certainly also a bigger commitment in Moscow to actually talk through things, which we have not seen in Moscow attitudes to many European capitals. And of course, you all know and have in your head the recent and less than recent examples. So my question to Fyodor and to Angela and to Kadri is, what should the Europeans learn and how should they adapt their own way and manner of speaking with Russia, given how US-Russian exchanges of niceties have evolved in the last months, and given that now this summit is happening and both sides seem to be committed to trying to make it work. Okay, so I'll start with Fyodor.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, you asked about possible reset, and I see questions in the chat, some fears that Biden might sleepwalk in a reset. Don't be worried. There is no chance for reset at all. I don't believe there is any of sides expecting or wanting this. And if talking about reset, if you mean what was the case 10 years ago with Obama administration, then there are absolutely no preconditions for that, because a reset at that time was not just improving relationship. That was a package deal, which was basically discussed and then agreed between Russia and the United States. Package deal which included several, not many, but several issues. It was some kind of exchange of interests. Russia was interested in a couple of things, including, for example, at that time, WTO membership. United States was interested in Russia joining sanctions against Iran, and some other minor issues. And the foundation for that was the new START agreement, as always. So, and that worked for that period, for that point. At that point, I don't see anything like this today. There are no interests which can be linked and exchanged. It's no agenda existing. It was an agenda at that time, now it's not. And even as I mentioned in my intervention, even this issue about strategic stability, unlike what we had 10 years ago, it was, all of us remember, those negotiations were tough enough and quite complicated, but at least it was a very clear framework for that, just to build up and build on the whole tradition of arms control treaties. Now, what from my point of view, what is different, this tradition of arms control treaties has been exhausted. We need a new scheme, we need a new model. And that will take significant time and significant intellectual efforts as well to try to find this. So at the end of the day, we don't see any elements of the reset like it happened during Obama administration. As for Nord Stream 2, which was mentioned here, I think it's very simple. The reason why Biden administration decided not to press further on this is not their willingness to please Russia, but that was a willingness not to get engaged in a conflict with Germany. Germany demonstrated very firm commitment to this project, rightly or wrongly, that's another discussion, but it happened, and Biden administration decided at the end of the day that the relationship with Germany is more important than hypothetical advantages from killing this project. I guess if Trump would be re-elected he would do it. Maybe he would. He was very keen to stop this project for his own reasons, but for him, a relationship with Germany was not that important. Maybe in case of his re-election, the situation would be different. But for Biden, it's another hierarchy of priorities, so to say. As for green agenda, again, I think it's a very important field for discussion, for conversation, for negotiations, and Russia will be forced to get engaged in that absolutely, with Europeans, with Americans, with everybody. But it's not about nice common work. It's about competition, clearly. Be it carbon tax, be it carbon, this adjustment mechanism, as Nicu mentioned. This is a very competitive issue. It's not about global solutions for global problems. It's about how each country or each group of countries will try to address this problem, but of course based on their own interests. So I don't believe it's quite obvious that this issue will be another field for very tough diplomatic and political work. Maybe at the end of the day it will be harmonized, but not easily. Even I would dare to guess, even between United States and Europe, not to talk about China, Russia, and the rest. As for European Union, I don't believe that the European Union should be deeply involved in the US-Russian conversation. From my point of view, maybe I'm totally wrong, being outside Europe for a year and a half now, and maybe for a longer period. But I would suggest that the main task for the European Union is to sort out all domestic problems and to understand how European Union will be rebuilt in years to come, and what kind of European Union we will see 5 or 10 years from now. And this agenda, the domestic agenda, is much more important. Russia is not that important in this context for the European Union. And Russia will not be, a relationship with Russia will not be the highest priority. Same basically for Russia, because we have a very unlinear and very complicated, sometimes hardly understandable process here inside. But there is no question that Russia has entered a period of transformation, and this transit period is here. We don't know when this transit will end up and how it will end up, but it's here, and everybody knows that. So in this regard, as long as Russia and the European Union are deeply involved in domestic troubles and domestic problems, they will deal with this primarily, not with the bilateral relationship.
Thank you very much, Fyodor. Fyodor will have to leave a bit earlier, so I'll throw in 2 more questions, and then we'll go to Angela and Kadri. So one question from the speakers is partly related, Fyodor, to where you ended. Kadri used the word neo-isolationism, and one of the questions is about, basically how bad it is. Because of COVID, there hasn't been a lot of travel. Once we all get vaccinated and our countries recognize each other's certificates and digital passports, how much of the previously existing people-to-people, think tank to think tank, and diplomatic contacts with Russia do you expect to retake? Not just because video conferences will replace some of it, but for good. Do you think we will witness a significant disruption in these lower level interactions between Russia and Europe and the US compared to what it was for, reasons related to political issues rather than Zoom being so much better than a real life coffee in the lobby of a hotel? So how deep is this trend, Fyodor? How do you see things evolving on that front? And the second question is about China. every time in Europe or the US, someone wants to reset relations with Russia, they say, that's the way to compete with China is by driving a wedge between Russia and China. So one of the questions in the chat is, how do you see these things? Do you expect America to try and do that? What are the parameters of a potential success or failure to, have a conversation on China with Russia in a way that brings about some change or some mutual understanding on that front?
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, about disruption of contacts. Contacts are being disrupted for objective reasons, and that will that will be reality for a while, certainly ahead of us. I don't believe that we will overcome this pandemic or post-pandemic syndrome very soon. So in Russia, certainly we now have a new rise of infections, and maybe somewhere else we will see it in the world. So it will be much longer than we expected initially. But I think the reason why I don't believe that relationship will not be back to the pre-pandemic stage is not so much political. If we speak about political relationship between Russia and the EU or Russia and the United States, I think what pandemic did, pandemic emphasized that actually all countries or group of countries have different agendas. Those agendas might be competing or not competing. Maybe sometimes they are just parallel. But that's fact of life, that pandemic demonstrated that universalism of the global age, which we got used to, especially in recent 15, 20 years, it's not necessarily the only way how the world exists. And I think that will be more important than political agreements or disagreements. And the experience which we had a year plus ago, that global world can be, how to say it, can be switched off just for during 1 week or 2 weeks. I think this experience will have much bigger impact on our mentality everywhere, not just in Russia or in Europe or in China, but that manifested the beginning of a new period of international development. And that means, coming back to your question, that means also that agendas between, say, Russia and European Union, Russia and particular countries, Russia and all the rest, those agendas will be at least corrected and adapted, not because of political controversies, but because of different setups of tasks which each country and each nation believes are important for it. So I guess it's subjective. It's not about political divergency, which is the case anyway. Of course, we see that domestic agendas are different since quite a while, and pandemic didn't change it. Pandemic just catalyzed it. So what was another question?
China, the China question.
The China question. That was a dream of Donald Trump, to drive a wedge between Russia and China. He did not know how to do it, and he, at the end of the day, he failed. I don't think that Biden has this goal. It does look like this. Rather the opposite. In all documents we see, be it in the United States or in NATO context, there is basically Russia/China, China/Russia as the biggest problem or challenge or threat. So it's rather to push them together. if we disregard this Western factor, I think a Russian relationship with China will be the biggest challenge for Russia in years, if not decades to come. How to maintain very good relationship with this country, because to have such a neighbor, huge, rising, and with an ambition to be one of the world's biggest, most important countries, and not to have excellent relationship with such a neighbor, that's just crazy thing. So Russia will need to have as good relationship with China as possible, while trying to find all ways to balance, to balance Chinese weight, to balance Chinese influence. And this is a huge, huge work which should be done, but it has its own logic. It has not so much to do with the relationship with the United States or Europe.
Thank you, Fyodor. Angela? Choose, but there is China, there is the Russian domestic situation, centralization, neo-isolationism, fortress Russia, all of those subjects, I'm sure you...
And Ukraine too, huh?
And Ukraine.
Okay, let me just start off with the reset. So the Biden administration explicitly said in the beginning, we're not interested in a reset, we want a stable and predictable relationship. But in fact, stable and predictable is kind of a reset already, because clearly in the last 4 years, we did not have a stable and predictable relationship. So I see this as a kind of a lower grade reset than the Obama reset, which was much more ambitious. But the idea that, and no American administration ever gives up on this, they all tried at the beginning, that there must be a more productive way to interact with Russia is still there. Now, the difference is President Biden is very realistic about Russia. As Kadri said, he's met with President Putin a number of times, and when he was vice president, even as when he was in the Senate. So I think he's pretty realistic about what's happening inside Russia. So he doesn't have illusions about what's possible, but he still believes, which I think is a natural human desire, that maybe there can be a way, as I said, to establish these guardrails and to have a minimum of an understanding with Russia on certain issues so that we can move forward and work together on others. I don't think this is something that the Central Europeans should be worried about. I think President Biden is very aware of the issues that exist in Central and Eastern Europe. And it's not as if these interests are going to be sold away. But on the question, does this ultimately change the way in which Europeans speak to Russia? I think we'll just have to wait and see, what happens during the summit and then after it, if they can in fact continue, if in these various fora to cooperate, and if the relationship begins to improve, then it might affect it. But again, and I agree with Fyodor, what we're mainly talking about is managing confrontation, but managing it in a more efficient way than it was managed in the last 4 years when it was so chaotic. And then to reiterate that when Russia became such a toxic issue domestically in the United States, that it made it impossible in many ways to carry out a rational policy. Now, in terms of Ukraine, so obviously as Vice President, Biden made 6 trips to Ukraine. He's been very involved in it, as you probably know. It was also something that the Trump people raised in a completely different context during the campaign, but he certainly has an interest in it. I think on the one hand, the interest in Ukraine still comes back to what's happening domestically there, and the repeated messages that the Ukrainian president and the Ukrainian government has to come to grips with the things that corrode the ability of Ukraine to function well as a state, and that is the corruption. And this is it's something that continues to be a subject of discussion, and was when Secretary Blinken went recently to Ukraine. Then, in terms of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, there will be, I think, continued support, military support and assistance to Ukraine. I think we don't know yet whether the Biden administration will appoint another special representative, as Trump did, because one can question what happened there. There is the whole discussion about is it still worth pursuing the implementation of the Minsk agreements, or is this just out of date and is not going to help? So I think all of those issues might come up. But I think, the general goal, if it's in 10 years' time, obviously, would be to see a stable, productive Ukraine with an economy that's growing, and where corruption has been lessened, and where there is no more conflict, with Russia. Now, Biden made it clear. I mean, I know President Putin a couple of days ago again brought up the subject of Ukrainian NATO membership. Biden himself, when asked about that in the last 2 weeks, essentially said, we're not there yet. Let's not talk about that. Let's talk about encouraging Ukraine in its Euro-Atlantic aspirations. So there's absolutely no chance in this current US administration that anyone's going to push NATO membership. Everyone understands that this is something which, even though, of course, in the Bucharest summit, it's in the language there, that this is something for the future and for the more distant future than it is now. Now, that doesn't, and I think the real concern in the US remains on Ukraine, whether Russia, in fact, will, whether, what those troops are doing, and whether there might still be some more Russian incursions there. And that'll be one thing. Obviously, if that does happen, then there would have to be a stronger response to this. Now, Russia, China. So as I said in my remarks, I do think that the Biden administration would like to have a relationship with Russia that would at least induce the Russians to question the relationship with China. I think that that's not going to happen. I think that what the Biden administration needs to do is not do what the Trump administration did, which is to push Russia and China closer together when you had a trade war with China and you had all these sanctions on Russia. It should not conduct policies that do that. But I think they'll still be exploring this. But as I say, I personally don't think that that's going to happen. And as Fyodor said, I mean, for Russia, the relationship with China is very important. It's made the choice to partner with China, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. Let me say something about the isolationism. Of course, there's been COVID, but of course, we do notice that just in terms of and I'm speaking as an academic now, student exchanges, faculty exchanges, these kinds of things, they were already closing in on this before COVID, and I don't know whether it's going to recover afterwards. In other words, what I see is trying to isolate Russian society, and particularly younger Russians, from interacting with their peers, be it in Europe or particularly in the United States, making it much more difficult to do that. And also, I think, discouraging some of the academic exchanges, even on the level of faculty and things like that. And I think that's very regrettable. And obviously, the Biden administration is going to try as much as it can to keep the links to civil society in Russia, but where we see that is closing in.
Mm-hmm.
Kadri?
Yes. Try to answer the question you asked me and to echo some of the other points. Well, why doesn't Europe talk with Russia the way Trump, Biden, or Erdogan do? But, well, I think we have to accept that Europe is a different kind of animal.
Europe will never match Trump or Erdogan.
Exactly.
But what do you learn from other states which are more successful in making themselves heard in Moscow than the European methodology? We can take 3% of Trump, 5% of Erdogan. Is there anything in it, or we just scrap the project?
I think, well, what I have noticed about Moscow, they happily talk with everyone on files where they think that this country is an interlocutor. They can have serious discussions with Estonia on things that have to do with common border or clean water in Peipsi Lake. They don't shun us just because we are small. They shun us because if when we try to have a word on files where we have actually no say and no policy. And I think that's a big lesson for Europe. For years we wanted to make Russia to discuss Syria with us, but we never had a policy on Syria that was any realistic. And it's quite logical that Russia didn't go along with it. But there are policies where Europe is a kingmaker. Many regulatory fields. I think we have affected how Gazprom conducts its business. I think climate and carbon adjustment mechanism are big things, and Russia is already interested in these. So I think this is something where Europe is really quite big, at least potentially. Now, on many classical foreign policy files, I think our influence would stem from the least direct circumstances. If we are a great regulatory power, some of that could be converted into these other foreign policy files as well, without going out to Syria to drop bombs or so forth. But right now, I don't think we are there. As Fyodor pointed out, that Europe should do some work on its domestic arrangements. And that's a very prevalent view in Moscow. They don't know what will become of Europe. Are we there to stay as European Union? In what shape? What sort of policymaker we will be, with what sort of leverage? And that, I think, hinders us in our relationship with Moscow, because we cannot convert our other qualities into foreign policy influence, which otherwise we could if our status was not under dispute the way it is right now. So I think partly it can be solved with homework, partly I think with time, because I think Russians actually, they tend to exaggerate trends about Europe. And right now they think that downward trend is more absolute than actually it is. But they don't take our word for it, that it's not the case. They need other evidence. But I think time will tell them, time will show them. As to resets, we should have another seminar about resets, because I feel that whole concept has been totally hijacked and is being applied on basically everything. Whereas, reset actually had concrete policy ideas behind it. But as I said earlier, I think it was miscommunicated. I think probably Obama hoped for bigger success than was possible at the time. But I guess also Russia misunderstood it. I remember one Russian expert from Munich also very well know, saying in one seminar that, we thought that we were finally accepted as a great power. It was great disappointment when we realized it was only about a limited set of issues. So, and that's where I think is difference with the current day, that any agreements that one can reach today are based in fundamental disagreements, and no one has illusions that these disagreements are not there. And I think no one also has illusions that they can easily win this fundamental disagreement about rules, norms, and world order. Earlier, that might have been the case, and that in a way made smaller disagreements even harder to resolve, because they were part of a bigger. But more lately, I have coined the term and testing it, frustrated maximalism. I think the West has seen that we have not managed to change Russia the way we hoped in the 1990s. But Russia might also have seen that the West is not granting it the sort of geopolitical status it has been wanting during the much of the last 30 decades. And I think, sort of frustration, maximalist wishes being frustrated could make everyone a little bit more humble and actually provide more adequate ground for agreements on smaller and concrete issues where you can agree. And on others, you agree to disagree.
Thank you very much, Kadri. So I would have two more questions. Angela, the first question goes to you. So we've heard Fyodor basically dismissing Europe, saying you should solve your own problems. COVID wrecked your ability to be a strong voice on US, Russia, when the big guys talk in the room. I hear a lot of Europeans looking at Russian excess mortality, and of course the Europeans are quite upset that they lag behind in vaccination, behind the US, the UK, and Israel. But whenever we look at Russian excess mortality and the fact that Russia has vaccinated 3 times fewer people per capita than the EU, they look at Russia and say, oh, Russia should be solving its own problems before making this claim to being a global player. So there's a lot of kind of mutual dismissiveness and sometimes misreading, sometimes not. So my question to you, Angela, is what do you feel is the US view of European relevance, usefulness, irrelevance in this US-Russia dialogue? Where do you need Europe? Do you hope Europe will play a bigger role? There's the whole burden sharing debate. Of course, we've seen President Biden trying to reinvest and rekindle the relationship. But what does America expect from Europe on the Russia, Ukraine, Eurasia, and Eastern European files? And what are the parameters of burden sharing on these issues? And to me, burden sharing should not be about the NATO 2% defense spending, but how do you better burden share what, the promotion of US and European interests in Eastern Europe writ large? And the second question, there's a question from a speaker on what do we do in the Balkans? Through the Russia angle or without the Russia angle? If you have a view on that, fine. If not, it's also fine. We don't have a lot of time. Please.
Okay, well, thank you. That's a huge question. I mean, first of all, as you can see with Biden on day one, I mean, he understood the importance of restoring the relationship with Europe, which obviously in the Trump administration, was falling apart. Trump nearly left NATO. In fact, some of his senior advisors thought that he was going to do that or have the US leave NATO. He was dismissive of the European Union. And Biden really believes, as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he was always very committed to the transatlantic relationship. So he does believe in working with Europe, in the importance of Europe. And we've seen that even before this current trip to Europe. The issue of burden sharing hasn't gone away. So it's not going to be like in the Trump administration, threatening people, countries, if they don't pay 2% of their GDP, spend it on defense. But it is going to be, I think, an expectation that there will be a more equitable burden sharing. And that's not only defense spending, but I guess it's also actions. I think there is, when Biden says that he wants to have a coordinated policy toward Russia with Europe, it's not only with Germany, it's obviously with other European countries too. And one of the problems from the American point of view is the European Union is hardly united on how to deal with Russia. And clearly, Poland and the Baltic states have a different view or somewhat different view of how to deal with Russia than Germany or France or Italy or Greece. So one of the issues there is how do you coordinate a Russia policy with a large group of countries who themselves don't agree on it. Sanctions is going to be part of this. Obviously, during the Obama administration, there was good coordination between the EU and the United States on sanctions against Russia. The EU sanctions are still in place. The US obviously has more sanctions. The Biden administration is reviewing all of the sanctions to see whether they're not only on Russia, but on other countries, to see whether they're effective and to see which ones maybe should be rethought. And so I think as part of that process, there's also going to be a dialogue, a discussion with Europe about sanctions going forward. Obviously, we have more robust sanctions now against Russia than the European Union does. So I think that the US definitely believes that there is a role for the US and Europe to work together in dealing with Russia on some issues, and we've already heard it. Europe cannot really play, and that is the broader kind of strategic stability questions. But there are other issues, for instance, the future of intermediate range nuclear weapons, where certainly the Europeans are very interested since there's no INF treaty anymore. Is this a subject of discussion between Russia and the United States, and how much will Europe be involved in this? The strategic stability talks will be bilateral, but I'm sure that there will be aspects of that where where Europeans will be consulted on this. There is NATO, and that will clearly be a forum that will play into that. So I think, even though we've had the vaunted pivot to Asia under Obama, and then under Biden, there is this focus on China. The understanding is that, our allies are very important, our alliances. This is what enables the US to act as as an effective global actor. And so I think there will be more attention paid. That doesn't mean that there won't be tensions and differences between Europe and the United States, but I think the prospects going forward are much better now, because you have a US administration that wants to re-engage with the world and understands and accepts the need for multilateralism. On the Western Balkans, I don't think that any policy pronouncements have made. The chat mentions the executive order. Clearly, the US sees Russia as playing a much more active role in the Western Balkans and trying to thwart, if you like, the desire, particularly of Europe, to have more integration in this part of the world. And we see what's happening, obviously, with Serbia, what's happening in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and a number of other issues. So as I say, I don't have any sense yet of exactly where that policy is going. Remember, we don't have our nominated Assistant Secretary for Europe, Karen Donfrey, hasn't had her hearings yet. And there are still a significant number of positions in the State Department that need to be filled. Kadri, you mentioned the fact that they're reprofessionalizing the State Department, which is very important, but they still need to get the people in office. So I think that's about all I can say about that.
Kadri, would you have any follow-up remarks?
Not on these issues,
Yes.
but actually what
issues, we accept them as well. The issues never end, and
yes,
they always end up. So if you see things we don't see, that's even better.
Well, just two things I thought of saying earlier, but forgot. Well, one is Russia, China, and yeah, just to probably repeat what others have been saying, I don't think we can split Russia from China. I think there are two things, and Fyodor put it very well. For Russia, China is a big strategic thing, and they need to manage they need to have some sort of cordial relationship. But also right now, psychologically, Russia is still so much obsessed with the West. They think that the West is trying to tell them how they need to organize their life, and China is not. And, regardless of how tough and brutal China might be on other files, that is such a big value for Russia, and that sort of makes them gravitate towards China up to a limit, though, because another thing that I also learned, I had a chance to spend a week in Moscow recently, and Moscow has invested a lot in face recognition technology, which they are now using to crack down on protests, increasingly high-tech manner. But what I learned, all that technology they use, it's either Russian made, or if that was not possible, it's American made, but not Chinese. In these brain centers of these systems, China has supplied only some very low-key technologies, such as power banks and so forth. And that's very conscious choice. It's not because transit with China was cut off. It's not an accident. So my long-term view is that the more Russia becomes exposed to China, the friendlier way will actually eventually become towards us. Because we might be nasty in our own ways, but I think China, in some files, clearly China is a lot tougher than we are. But what disturbs me the most, and here I would like to say a few words about isolationism or COVID. I think COVID really has impacted our ability to read Russia, and Russia's ability to read us. Another key takeaway from my week in Moscow was exactly how differently we interpret the recent events, and how on many issues where I think the West has given sort of minimal, very moderate reaction to Russia, so on Navalny or on Belarus. We bent over backwards to signal that we didn't want to make Belarus a bone of contention. And Moscow reads it still differently. They read aggressive designs into our actually very modest change. And likewise, I think we misread Russia's intentions on many issues, and that worries me a little bit. And it also worries me that, you know, experts do not travel. Russians discuss the West, and Westerners discuss Russia without really ever setting foot there. And it started because of visa bans ahead of pandemic, but pandemic has magnified it. And I really wonder if something could be done about that, because otherwise we start analyzing the Russia that we imagine, and Russia starts analyzing the West that exists in their imagination, and that is dangerous. We should deal with real countries rather than the countries we have fought up.
Thank you very much, Kadri. I confess that it's a bit utopic, seeing how you know, sometimes France and Germany or France and the UK misread each other. And of course, the latest conversation we know here is that France just announced the intention to withdraw and cease the Barkhane operation, which left many of the, and announced that the EU would take much of that operation, to the surprise of many other EU member states. So I think that's a kind of fight worth having, reducing the gaps in analysis and understanding, and most of us are trying to do that. But of course, we should also be somewhat resilient in understanding that we'll never entirely succeed, but any millimeter we can get closer to that will and is likely to have a good and positive, potentially positive impact on the course of global history. Entre guillemets, and with a bit of thank you very much. It was nice seeing many friends and many new names that I have not heard, and I would like to thank enormously the speakers for taking the energy and the time and the intellectual effort to share with us our thoughts. I'm sure next week we'll have more conversations where we'll try to assess whether that handshake or that look signaled that we're staying in the nasty Cold War or we're going into a better and nicer Cold War. So this conversation will continue. We at ECFR will be following as much as we can, and we can follow a lot of that bilateral relationship. Stay tuned. Thank you very much and have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.